Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Osteoporosis Canada's webinar, Cooking with Pantry Staples During COVID-19. My name is Tracie Napoli, Director, Marketing and Communications for Osteoporosis Canada, and I will be your moderator for today. This presentation will provide general information about cooking and food knowledge. It is not intended as individualized health or nutrition advice. If you have questions about nutrition, consult a physician or registered dietitian. Before we begin, please note you can enter your questions into the question box to the right of your screen. Or if you are watching this on an iPhone, there may be a question icon at the bottom of your screen. In addition to answering some of the questions that were submitted in advance, we will also attempt to answer those submitted during this live webinar within the time available. The unanswered questions will be addressed after the webinar is over, and an email will be sent out with that information. Please remember to keep your questions relevant to the topic of cooking with pantry staples, and also we cannot provide medical advice to specific individual questions. During this time of physical distancing and self-isolation, it is important to get the nutrients needed for strong and healthy bones. Today, our topic will address sources of calcium and protein that can be found in pantry staples when fresh ingredients are low or not available. You can find today's recipe, Oven Meatless Meatballs, by visiting osteoporosis.ca/recipes. Our presenter is Emily Richards, a professional home economist, freelance food writer, chef, and cookbook author who also enjoys culinary instruction for home cooks who want to learn more and have fun in the kitchen. She is the author and co-author of 9 cookbooks, which include topics from Italian cuisine, weeknight dinners, glycemic index diets, and comfort foods. Emily writes and develops recipes for cookbooks, print, and online publications and websites that include everyday cooking and healthy eating. Please welcome Emily.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So happy that you could join me here this afternoon. I'm in my own kitchen, as most of us are. We're physical distancing, and what I love doing is cooking. So I feel very glad and honored to be in your kitchens or your homes, or maybe you're relaxing on the couch this afternoon. It is fabulous that we are getting together because we want to look for meal ideas, because we're going through this process right now that's a little bit different for all of us. It's a little bit of physical distancing, getting really close to maybe some people that you're living with, and finding out a little bit more about technology, for sure, for me, and different types of food and things like that. So I know looking for meal ideas for healthy aging and staying active during these very interesting times. We really want to make good food choices to increase our activity level and stay on top of things, but most importantly for bone health and our overall well-being. So today, we're going to be making and focusing on some pantry staples that you may already have at home, or you may not, and you don't have to worry, because I'm going to be giving you substitutions as we work through the recipe. And if you don't have those things, you might have something else that will work with the recipe. Osteoporosis Canada recommends getting calcium and protein from food to help manage osteoporosis. So to get this recipe, you saw it posted already, but please check out osteoporosis.ca for many more recipes and a lot of other interesting information that you will need to find out more about calcium and protein. So this whole physical distancing thing, it might be keeping us a little bit away from grocery stores and not necessarily buying the things that we normally buy. And that means cooking from our pantries has become a little bit more viable for us, and might not be the preferred choice, but you can definitely make some great choices and make options for your family and for yourself during these times. So there's great pantry items available that include sources of calcium and protein, and that will ensure that our bones stay strong and healthy. So this in particular recipe is the Oven Meatless Meatballs. Now I know that sounds funny because there's no meat in it. So if you wanted to, you could call them meatless veggie balls or meatless balls. However you refer to them, they are absolutely delicious and have lots of versatility. And the main ingredient is something that maybe we often think of with vegetarian food, and that is canned beans. Now, we maybe have a variety of different canned beans in our pantries, and you might be wondering if you could use what you already have. This recipe in particular has chickpeas in it. Now, if you don't have chickpeas, that's okay, because I today did two different versions because initially I thought I didn't have chickpeas, but then I did a little bit of a deeper search and I found some. And I did a version with white beans as well, okay? So if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to post them. And I will be addressing some of the questions that we got before we got started as I work through the recipe. So hopefully they'll be triggered as I'm working through, and we'll get those questions answered for you. So let's start off with those beans, as I was mentioning. We're using canned beans. So typically in the grocery store, they're 19-ounce cans. Sometimes you'll find a 14-ounce can, which is just a slightly less amount, but not to worry. In total, what you need for this recipe is 4 cups of cooked beans. So whether that's chickpeas or the white beans that I mentioned, you might not have either, but I looked deeper in those cupboards and I actually had red kidney beans as well, which would be a great option to use, and they would have a darker color on the outside. So if you're looking more for a beefy look, red kidney beans would be a great option here for you. Now, what you want to do when you're using the canned beans is to drain them and rinse them. What that does is that takes away some of that packing liquid, which can give you a little bit of a salty flavor, and it gives a nice brighter flavor by rinsing that away. Now, in this recipe specifically, I've asked you to reserve some of that packing liquid. So before you dump it into your colander, just pour some out. I just have some in here in a little pitcher, just in case you find that your meatballs are a little dry. And once we get there, I'll show you what I mean. So dependent on the brand that you buy, the texture of the beans themselves can vary. So they could be a little bit tougher or drier, and some could be really, really soft. So having that little bit of packing liquid is a great way to kind of save yourself on either end. Now, no canned beans in the house. What are we going to do? Maybe you have some dried beans kicking around. These are some dried chickpeas. I also have kidney beans, black-eyed peas, those types of things that would work in this recipe, but they're all dried. Now, that takes a little bit of planning ahead when you have to cook those beans. What's great about all these beans is that they do contain calcium and protein, which is exactly what we're looking for, and fiber, which is always fabulous to have to keep you going for some energy as well. So these chickpeas or beans, whatever you're going to use, there's a couple ways that you can deal with them. You can actually soak them overnight. So put them in a container or bowl, fill it with water, and then keep it in the refrigerator overnight. And what will happen is that will be a slow absorbing process of that water to then cook them. So you'll take that out, drain that water off. They'll kind of look a little bit bigger than when you initially started, and then put them in a pot with fresh water and bring them to the boil. And then you can simmer them. This is where you have to do some taste testing, which is okay by me. It may take 30 minutes, it may take over an hour. It really depends on how old your dried beans and they are. So if you don't know how long you've had those chickpeas in the cupboard for, they may take a little bit longer. So you will have to take one out, test it. You want a nice soft texture to it, and then you can drain it, save some of that cooking liquid just as we would with the canned, and then give them a rinse and you're ready to go. Now, if you feel like just cooking up 4 cups of chickpeas is not worth your time, cook up the whole bag because they actually freeze really, really well. All beans, once they're cooked, freeze beautifully. And you can actually measure them in 2-cup portions, which is typically how much is in a 19-ounce can, so that when you're making a recipe that calls for a can of beans, chickpeas, or whatever you're making, you can just take it out of the freezer and add it right into the recipe, okay? So the next thing I want to do is talk about our flax. So in this recipe, not only are these meatless, they're actually vegan because we're not using an egg. So to replace that egg, which is to help bind our meatballs, we're using flax, we're using ground flax. So if you have flax seeds, you can just put them into a little coffee grinder or spice grinder and buzz it up. And you want just a nice fine powder. Now, if you have either flax seed or ground flax, it's always best to keep it in the freezer, just so that it doesn't go rancid. So buy what you need, keep it in the freezer. And this is a great addition. It actually does have protein in it as well, fiber for sure. And this is fabulous to add to smoothies, anything that you're eating in the morning. I love it in my oatmeal as an added hit. It's also great sprinkled on top of a salad, just for a nutty crunch. So what we're going to do is, there's 2 tablespoons of flax here. I'm going to add 6 tablespoons of water. And the reason why I'm doing this now is because it does need to sit for a little while so that that flax rehydrates. Much like if you're cooking those beans, you want to rehydrate that as well. So I think that was 3, 4, 5. This is real. I'm actually cooking, so I do have to pay attention to what I'm doing. I think that was 6. All right. Now, if you see me as we're going through the webinar this afternoon, looking this way and picking up my phone, it's because I want to find out about your questions. So I'm not going on my phone to be rude. I want to find out if we have any questions as we go along. So you'll have to be patient as I do that. I may have to take off my glasses to read it. All right, so give this a little stir. So if you didn't want to use flax, or if you didn't have flax, you would replace this amount with 1 egg. Okay, 1 large egg. So I'm going to set this aside because I did do it in advance, because I did want to show you the difference. So this is a little bit thicker now. So this has been sitting for 15 minutes, okay, and it's a little bit sludgy, technical term, and it's thickened. So the flax has absorbed the water, which is perfect to give us a similar texture, and it'll bind just like the egg does. And this is actually a substitute I use often in baking. So if you want to make cupcakes or quick breads that call for 1 egg, this is a great substitute for you to use, because it will give you that really lovely texture that eggs provide. And in our case, it's working as our binder. And kudos to our Canadian farmers, because we're celebrating the prairies with this recipe too. Between the flax and the beans, we've got it covered. All right, so let's get going here. I'm going to get my chickpeas into my food processor. So if you don't have a food processor, there's a few ways that you can deal with this. I wouldn't throw them in a blender, because that will be super frustrating. There won't be enough liquid to move the chickpeas around. But what I would do is put them in a resealable bag, and you can actually mash them with a rolling pin. So just roll back and forth, and you'll get a really good puree. The other thing you can do is put them in a bowl, and then use your potato masher to get them nice and fine. So I'm going to dump these in. So I've already rinsed these, and they've been draining nicely. We don't want to add extra water here. I'm going to just set this aside so you can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to put the lid on. So I'm going to pulse these around a little bit to start breaking them up. And the other thing you want to do is keep a spatula nearby so that you can scrape down the sides, okay, as we go along, to make sure that it's happening nice and evenly. There we are. Okay, so I'm going to just leave this here for the moment, and I'm going to hop over to my skillet, because we want to cook a few things here too. And by a few, I really only mean 2 things. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of oil, and I'm going to cook my onions and garlic. Now, if you wanted to, you could add them in, but I really want to build a little bit more flavor here. So cooking them for a little bit will help build flavor. It also helps take out some of the water in the onions. So again, we've taken the time to drain and rinse these. I've let them sit for a bit so they don't have a lot of moisture. But don't worry, we will be adding moisture, because you definitely don't want to have dry meatballs, okay? So I'm going to add my onion, and this has a lot of garlic in it. So we're definitely talking about good health. My background's Italian, so I love adding lots of garlic to things because I love the flavor, but I also love all the health benefits. All right, so we're going to just cook this for a few minutes. If it gets a little bit of color, that's quite all right, because that's just adding to the flavor. The caramelization of the onions, that's a little bit of sugar that's coming out, is just going to get a bit golden, and it'll add so much more flavor into our meatless meatballs. So some of the things that we're talking about is in pantry staples that you may or may not have, and the amount of calcium and protein. There's things that you may have on your shelves that you might not even realize that you can incorporate into recipes that will really add to your bone health, which is fabulous. And oftentimes, I worry about what the future will hold. So it's always good to think ahead and stay on top of things when I'm cooking, especially when it comes to health. All right, so I'm going to give this a stir. I pulled out a few things just to mention because you may have them and you might need them as substitutions. So we talked about flax, which is a great part of the recipe that we're using, but you could also use chia seeds. I know a lot more people have chia seeds in their pantry now. This is another one that you should keep in your freezer. You don't want them to be rancid. And we might not be using them as often as we think we need, but you could use this in place of the flax to be our binder. And again, it's great. It has calcium in it. It's great protein. I love making chia puddings with it, with yogurt for a breakfast treat, and it's fabulous. So if you have chia seeds, you could definitely use those in here as well. Now, the other thing that we're going to be adding, and this is a little bit of a surprise because it's not part of the recipe that you're going to see, but I will make sure that it gets posted, is we're going to make a little sauce for these meatballs as well, because as much as I like to eat them right off the pan, it's nice to change it up a little bit and serve it with a sauce. And we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so as that's cooking, I'm just going to see if there's any questions. So I will take a look here. Let's see. Wow, there's lots of questions. Thank you so much for all your questions, by the way. Oh, can this meatless recipe be used as a base for pizza? That is a fabulous idea. I love it. And yes, you can. I would actually, for the amount that it makes, I would make probably 2 smaller pizzas just because it'd be a little bit easier to handle. And in the recipe itself, when we go to bake the meatballs, you flip them halfway through. And I would do the same if I was using it as a pizza base, because it would add a little bit more of a golden brown color. And that will be different. I know I mentioned about the red kidney beans. It'll have that nice dark color to it. But with a lighter bean, like the white kidney beans, they'll be a little bit lighter in color than the chickpeas, for example, which have that natural kind of brownish color to them. Okay. That was a great question. I love that. Let's see, what's another question here? Would this freeze well? Great question. Freezing is something that, especially during this time, if you are taking the time, if you're working from home, maybe part of the day you're taking to prepare some meals for the rest of the week, or on the weekend you're doing that. Even outside of what's happening right now, you might take that time to prepare yourself for the busy work week. And you could freeze these. I would freeze them for about 2 weeks. Now, for those of you that are shaking your head and thinking, why only 2 weeks? I'm not going to freeze them. Here's my methodology, or my method for my madness. When I suggest it's 2 weeks, most often people will leave it in for about a month. So if I said you could freeze it for a month, you might leave it in for 6 months. So really, it's all about the texture of the product that you're freezing. There's not a lot of fat in these meatballs. So what ends up happening, there's nothing really to protect the texture of it. So if you leave it in the freezer for a really long time and you pull them out and you think they're going to taste as great as when I made them fresh, they won't. And that's disappointing. So I don't want you to have to deal with that. So 2 weeks is a good amount of time that the texture in the freezer won't change too much. And then you can pull them out, let them thaw, and you could use them right away or warm them up in a sauce quite easily. Okay, so great question. All right, so let's continue on with the recipe. I'm going to add our flax. And again, if you are not making these as a vegan meatball, you could definitely use an egg in here. And then I'm going to add, you could let this cool a bit, but I'm just going to go right ahead and add my onion mixture. And if you didn't have a regular, I just used a regular cooking onion, by the way. If you didn't have a regular cooking onion, you could use shallots, you could use green onions, you could use a red onion. And if you really, really don't like onion, you can leave it out. But it really does impart a lovely flavor overall. And you will notice a difference because you've cooked it, that it'll have that slight sweetness to it, which is really nice. All right, so then we're going to add some more flavor. Onions and garlic are always a great flavor addition in a recipe, but we want to bump it up a little bit more. And these, I'm guaranteeing that you probably have in your pantry. spices, herbs, those types of things we tend to keep on hand. And you might want to take a look at your herbs and spices that you have, especially if you haven't used them in a while. They haven't gone bad, but they may have lost some of their potency. So you might find that using that teaspoon of chili powder isn't cutting it for your chili anymore because it's been around for a little while. So you might have to double up on it. But we're going to use some herbs in this meatball today. I'm going to use a little bit of dried basil. You could use dried oregano. So I'm giving it a little bit of an Italian flair here. You could use dried oregano if you wanted to. You could use Italian seasoning. But if you wanted to change these up, maybe you wanted to make them a little bit more Tex-Mex, you could use some chili powder in here. That would also enhance the color a little bit. If you wanted to serve this maybe with some naan and rice and give it a curry spin, you could use a little bit of curry powder in here as well. So it's great. It has a lot of versatility to use the spices that you have in your pantry. Okay, and then of course I'm going to add a little bit of salt and pepper in here as well. And in the recipe, it calls for dried parsley, which is not always a staple in everybody's pantry. But for myself, I use fresh parsley. And the reason why I keep it in my pantry, and by pantry, it's not just about the shelves on your cupboards, it's also about your freezer and your refrigerator and what you keep on hand. Parsley lasts really, really well in your crisper drawer. So what I do is I come home, I wash it, pat it dry, wrap it in some paper toweling, put it back in the refrigerator, either in a container or in the bag I bought it, and then it lasts easily for a couple of weeks in my crisper. And this is fabulous because that little bit of green, especially on, I don't know how the weather is today where you are, but today here in Guelph, it's pretty gray. So having that little bit of green addition and fresh herb is absolutely delightful. And I'm going to add some fresh parsley. But if you have dried parsley, it will work beautifully. Because I'm using fresh, I'm actually using a little bit more. I'm using about a tablespoon of parsley. But if you have other fresh herbs, especially if you want to get rid of them, basil would be beautiful in here, some fresh oregano, even a little bit of mint would make this absolutely delicious. All right, dried breadcrumbs. I've seen a lot of things lately about getting people to make their own breadcrumbs, and dried breadcrumbs, really, really easy to make. If you don't have any before you start this recipe, break up some of that dry stale bread, put it in your food processor, buzz it around, and you have great dried breadcrumbs. You can add seasoning to them if you want, but it's not necessary in this recipe. And you can use whatever dry breadcrumbs you have, whether they're white or whole wheat, if they're seasoned or not. If they are seasoned and you're making this for someone who's vegan, make sure that they don't have cheese in it, because obviously that would not be their preference. But if you're using a seasoned breadcrumb, that will just heighten the flavor of the meatballs themselves. You could also use panko breadcrumbs. Now, if you use panko, they're not as golden as a traditional dry breadcrumb. So again, your meatballs will look a little bit lighter. So I'm going to add 3/4 of a cup right in there. I'm just going to pulse these together. And remember, I still have my spatula here to bring down the sides. And this is where you're going to take a look and see how dry your mixture is. So if it looks like it's not really coming together, because chickpeas are just a little bit drier than some of the other beans, that's when you're going to use a little bit of that liquid from the can, also known as aquafaba, for those of you that love using it for baking and cooking. Okay, so I'm just going to start. You can kind of tell at the bottom it's a little bit looser. It's working a little bit harder. So I'm just going to give it another stir. And you want this to be moist enough to stick together. So you can add just a tablespoon at a time, add some of that liquid. And add another little bit to it. And that should do it. Yes, I can start to see it all moving around. All right. I'm going to move this off to the side, get some things out of the way, because I want you to see how the meatballs come together. And I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. All right, this is about soaking the beans. If you soak beans, I assume you want to cook the beans before using them. Yes, definitely. So you're going to soak those beans first. So again, you can either do that overnight or do a quick soak method, which is actually bringing them to the boil and cooking them for 2 minutes. Drain them, put them into a pot. Use the same pot, but with fresh water this time, and then bring them to the boil and simmer them. So you do want to cook them fully because you don't want to end up with a firm bean for this recipe. You really want the nice moisture, as we would with any meatball, in the meatball itself, which is really important. Okay, so that's a great question. I'm going to just see if there's another question here. Can these balls be used in spaghetti sauce? They totally can. They totally can. And I actually have a little bit of sauce on my back counter to dip into later. So I know what I'm having for dinner. I don't know about you. All right, so I've taken the mixture off. If you want to, by all means, you could dump this out into a bowl and start scooping, but I don't want to dirty another bowl because guess who's doing the dishes? That's me. So I'm going to work right from my food processor bowl. Baking sheet, parchment paper, or if you have Silpat sheets, or if you have neither, you can just brush it with a little bit of oil because we don't want them to stick. Remember, we didn't add any fat to them, so they're a very lean meatball. So if there wasn't anything on our baking sheet itself, they would stick. So we definitely don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to give this another little stir. And actually, at this point, you could taste it to see if you wanted to add any other seasoning. Because we don't have the raw egg in there, we're using the flax, you could taste it and see if you want maybe a little bit more salt, or maybe you want to add a little bit more of those dried spices in there. Okay. All right, so I am using my favorite tool, or one of my favorite tools. It's a mini ice cream scoop. So if you make meatballs, if you make cookies, it's a fabulous tool to have. Put it on your next wish list because it's something that you'll find you'll use often. So each meatball is about 2 tablespoons. You could have really large meatballs if you want. You could go a little bit smaller if you're serving them as an appetizer. But I find this size works really, really well. So you just want to make sure that that mixture sticks together so you can see it does, and then you can just shape it into your meatball, okay? And then you're going to start lining them up, just like so. Now, if you find that the mixture feels a little bit dry still as you're rolling them, you still have some of that liquid that you can use, the liquid from our canned beans, that you can drizzle in a little bit more. If you find that it's too wet, you can add a little bit more breadcrumbs, okay? So these are very forgiving. You don't have to worry too much about being perfect because they will allow you to be imperfect and you can fix them. So this is something, one of the questions that came up before we started was about kids and cooking. And especially during this time, there's many people that are at home with their kids. I know all 3 of my kids are at home. And they may or may not want to help depending on their ages. If they're really young, definitely get them into the kitchen because they, as much as they may give you a bit of a heartache when they're helping, it really, really does benefit in the end result of them eating because they're helping, they're tasting as they go along, which I love to see little fingers tasting a chickpea out of the can or maybe feeling the texture of flax. All these things are really, really important. And especially right now, you might be using ingredients that typically you haven't used before because they've been in your pantry for a while. So it's a great opportunity to talk science, especially about rehydrating the beans and how those types of things work, or taking something out of the freezer and talking about thawing. It's really, really wonderful to see these types of interactions with kids. Older kids could definitely get in there and get them cooking. Let them pick out a recipe. And if they need help, maybe you're working, give them the ability to, at a certain time, if they need to ask a question, to come over and ask you so that they're not struggling on their own, which is really, really, can be very difficult, especially if, it's your first few times out cooking. Now, you could also give them a challenge. It could be like an Iron Chef competition to say, this is what we have in the pantry. Why don't you find a recipe to see how we can use it? So that could be a little bit fun too, and it might be a little bit more interesting for some older kids to get involved. Now, a lot of the times for younger kids, they can be picky, and getting a little bit of calcium and protein can be difficult into them. So what I used to do, my kids are a little bit older now, but I used to cut up small pieces, bite-sized pieces of things for them to try or pack up in little containers so that they felt like they were getting their own little package. So I would have things like little cubes of cheese out for them to try. Or if I was serving up something vegetarian with tofu, I would cut up a few pieces of tofu just for them to try on their own to see how they appreciated the texture or if they liked it, and see what else I could do with it. Exploring green leafy vegetables, that is always fun. And that's a great way to get some calcium, especially if you're looking for plant-based sources. You could have frozen kale in your freezer and add it to a smoothie, which is a great way for kids to see the color change in a smoothie, which is always fun. Their eyes light up, so it's fun to do. And you can make popsicles with them. So for those little kids that you're thinking, I don't know how I'm going to get some more calcium in them, maybe they're not a fan of sitting and having a glass of milk, but I know my kids really enjoyed those popsicles, and they didn't always know what was in them, but it was good for them, that's for sure. All right, so I'm not going to take all the time to show you how to roll meatballs. I'm sure most of you have rolled meatballs before. I'm just going to do a few more here. And again, as I'm rolling them, I'm continuing to check that consistency to make sure that it's not too wet or too dry, okay? So you'll get a couple dozen meatballs from this recipe. And I'm gonna go back to that pizza question. If you are making it with pizza, for a pizza base, what I would do is divide it and actually pat it out right onto the baking sheet and try to keep it as close together as you can. All right, so I'm gonna give my hands a wash. Then I'm gonna see if we have a couple other questions before I make something else. So these go into the oven at 375. We don't want them at too high of a heat because we don't want them to burn on the outside. We don't want a really dark color on the outside, and we want to retain that moisture in them. So I'm just going to pop these into my 375 oven. And I'm going to see what questions we have here. All right. All right, so we have a great question about calcium and protein in our beans that we're using. Now, if you're purchasing canned beans, the best place to check is right on the labels, okay? And you can do the comparison right in the grocery store. So I'm gonna do the comparison here because I have two cans, two brands. You can look at the brands as well. And then just follow the nutrition facts and they will have calcium in that nutrition fact. And on both here, it's there, and the red kidney beans have more than the chickpeas. So here, for 1 cup of red kidney beans, I have 15%. And for the calcium in our chickpeas, for half a cup, that's the other thing you have to check is what they are using for their serving size is 3%. So if we wanted to compare them equally, this would actually be 6%. You'd have to double it because this is for only half a cup, okay? So do take the time to read your labels because that will give you the most important information that you're looking for. And protein would work the exact same way. So you just follow down, there's my protein for 1 cup, it's 15 grams, okay? And then if I look here, protein is 6 grams. But what do we have to do? We have to double it. So it's actually 12 grams of protein, okay? So that's what you want to look for that information. And you would do the same thing with other pantry staples. I brought out a can of evaporated milk. And here's why, because I wanted to talk about a few other options to serve these meatless meatballs with. Before I forget, I have to put my timer on. Because I definitely don't want to forget about these meatballs. All right, so I wanted to talk, we talked about tomato sauce and how awesome that would be for this. But I wanted to give you a different sauce because my kids like creamy sauces with their meatballs. They love meatballs and sauce, but they also like creamy options too. So I thought this is a perfect opportunity to show how we can use some other pantry staples, hence the evaporated milk out. The other thing that many people may have in their pantries that they might not have used before, but now they have it, so they want to use it, is powdered milk, which is a great source of calcium and protein. So if you want to use that, you need 1/3 cup of the powdered milk to 1 cup of water. That would be the equivalent of 1 cup of fresh milk. So if you're struggling to find ways to use it, it's a great thing to have on hand because it stores really well, but you can actually use it as fluid milk in your recipes. So you can do that combination of 1/3 cup of powdered milk to 1 cup of milk, and you can chill it in the fridge so you can drink it as you would milk, and you could use it in recipes that call for milk. And that's why I wanted to show you this sauce. So if you're not using dairy products, you could use non-dairy products that are fortified, because that's really important. Again, read those labels to find out what is in the product that you're buying, because it is really important to know that a lot of those beverages need to be fortified with calcium. Okay, so let's get this started, and then I'm going to look at more questions. I already got this going a little bit ahead of time, and if you do want to keep this dish entirely vegan, then you will be using one of those fortified beverages. Okay, so I'm going to use, this is just the combination of powdered milk and water that I'm using to make that 1 cup. But you could very easily substitute this with some evaporated milk, and I would use 1 cup of each. Okay, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of broth. Again, something that you might have in the pantry, and you don't want soup anymore, but you have some broth sitting in the refrigerator that you need to use up. So if we're sticking with a vegan dish, we're going to use vegetable broth. But if you have chicken or beef broth, you could definitely use that in here as well. Okay, and then I'm also going to use a little bit of flour to thicken the sauce. And this is a great sauce to use for anything if you wanted to toss it with pasta. So again, using some of these pantry staples that you might have and thinking, how am I going to use them? Okay, all right, so I'm bringing up the heat. In my pan, I started off with a little bit of oil and some mushrooms. So this is a mushroom sauce, which would be great for pasta. It would be great to serve over the meatballs. It can even just be poured over some vegetables to jazz up your vegetables, because right now, those green beans might need a little bit of help. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any other questions. All right, great question about food processors and how would we get all those ingredients together. So if you don't have a food processor, you can mash everything with a potato masher in a bowl. Nice, easy peasy, it'll come together quickly. Or you can put your beans into a resealable bag and use a rolling pin and mash everything up, and then just mix everything in the bag. And that actually is a great way to get the kids to help. If everything's in that resealable bag and they're just mashing it all together, or maybe mom or dad needs some help and they need a stress release, that's a perfect way to do it. Get your hands to do the work and mix everything together. And if something comes up, maybe the kids need attention, or maybe one of your plants fell over because the dog knocked it over, you can actually take that mixture and put it in the fridge and deal with it later. Okay, so if you want to get ahead of the game, you don't have to cook these meatballs right away. You can actually shape them, wrap your baking sheet with plastic wrap, stick them in the fridge, and then bake them tomorrow. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, so I cooked my mushrooms for about 5 to 8 minutes. And what I want to do is get a little bit of color on those mushrooms and also extract some of the water so that I get the meatiness of the mushrooms and a really nice flavor. Oftentimes, we don't cook mushrooms long enough to get the flavor. Now, for those of you that might have a can of mushrooms kicking around because you don't know what's in the pantry, this would be a great place to use it as well. So drain those mushrooms, give them a little rinse, and then you can add those and cook them. I would still saute them. They are cooked, but saute them to start building that flavor a little bit, which is really nice. Okay, so then I'm going to add some flour. Now, these meatballs are not gluten-free, but if you do want to make them gluten-free, you can use gluten-free breadcrumbs. Okay, and that would make a really nice meatball. And then if you wanted to make this sauce gluten-free, I've made it with gluten-free flour. So just a gluten-free all-purpose flour works really well, or you could use cornstarch at the end of the sauce to thicken it, okay? So I'm just going to sprinkle on a couple tablespoons of flour, and I'm actually cooking it right in with the mushrooms. So it's going to pick up a little bit of the oil that's left in here, which isn't really that much, and then absorb some of the remaining moisture from our mushrooms, okay? And then I'm going to start to add my liquid, but I'm going to switch over to a whisk because I want to whisk in my milk. And this is just a great pan sauce. If you didn't want to, we had a question earlier about doing these meatballs in a skillet as opposed to the oven, and you could definitely do that. Just make sure that there's enough oil in the pan and that you're tending them so that you can turn them to get a really nice golden brown color on them. Then I'm gonna add just a little bit of our broth, and that just helps lighten up our sauce a little bit, about half a cup. And then I have an optional ingredient in here, which I love the flavor of it when I'm cooking. It's just a little bit of dry sherry. So if you have that in your pantry, you could definitely use it, but it's not necessary at all. You can leave it out completely, okay? I just love the flavor with mushrooms. So we're just gonna let that simmer and thicken because we are actually gonna add some cooked meatballs to this sauce. So you can make the meatballs ahead of time, and then when you want to warm them up, what you can do is then warm them right up in the sauce, okay? So I'm gonna take a look at some more questions here because I know there was a few others. And I wanted to talk a little bit about plant-based diets and pantry because oftentimes we think, how are we going to eat balanced and incorporate that protein and calcium into our diet? Well, there's lots to choose from. We have beans, which we talked about, and nuts. Having things like almonds around, either to snack on or to stir into. Actually, if you had some ground almonds, they would be lovely in these meatballs. Just to add a nice little bit of texture and flavor. I would actually take out some of the breadcrumbs and add the ground almonds in there. That would be lovely. That would be a great addition. Other things that you could add or think about when you're changing over or trying to include more plant-based food is definitely our vegetables. Lots of green and orange vegetables of all color. We love eating the rainbow, and the amount of calcium that are in those green leafy vegetables are fabulous. And they make wonderful dishes, and they freeze really, really well. If you got a donation of fresh kale from your garden and you don't know what to do with it all at once, what you can actually do is blanch it. So in a pot of hot water, simmering water, put it in for about a minute or so till it turns really bright green. Rinse it with cold water and that's in the freezer. So you have that kale later on for maybe you want to serve it with some of these meatballs as a side dish. It would be absolutely delicious. So this sauce doesn't take long to thicken. It's simmering away here. I'm just going to turn down the heat a little bit, and I'm going to look at my phone and see what other questions we have before I put the meatballs in to our sauce here. All right. So someone asked about the of this recipe, and use the Osteoporosis and the full nutritional breakdown there. So if you're looking obviously for the calcium and protein content, that is all. So take a look at the website and you will find it there. This is a great question. Can you use oat flakes instead of the breadcrumbs? And oat flakes are a little bit different than breadcrumbs, but you definitely can, or you could use quinoa flakes. Which if you were using the quinoa flakes, that would actually give you a gluten-free product as well, which is fabulous, okay? So I'm gonna grab the meatballs because I did cook some ahead of time. And as I said, these are the white kidney beans that I use. So they're a little bit lighter in color. And the way the light's hitting them, they're very, very light in color. But you're gonna put them into that 375-degree oven for about 15 minutes. Then you're gonna turn them over so you'll get a nice golden brown color. And then what you're going to do is let them cook for about another 10, okay? And then you're going to have these beautiful golden brown meatless meatballs from the oven. So you can let them cool. And this is where, if you're letting them cool, maybe you're going to take half and put them in the freezer for another meal and keep half out. Or you can let them cool, put them in the fridge, and then enjoy them the next day. What we're going to do is take some of these meatballs and put them right into our sauce. I did make them a little bit earlier, so they do need to be warmed up. So I'm just going to take them and tuck them into my sauce. And you don't want to overcrowd them. You want to give them a little bit of space to move around. So right now, the outside is a little bit crunchy, which is great. Gives it a nice little different texture. So I'm going to put some in there. And then I also have, we talked about tomato sauce. I also have a little bit of tomato sauce here. So this could be pizza sauce. And this is a great way for small hands to enjoy their meal. So maybe they don't like sauce on their meatballs, but they'll have it on the side. So you could definitely put a few of these little meatballs for little hands Toothpicks sometimes help too. I'm going to put these last two in here because I have room for them. And this is a great little meal for small hands or big hands to just sit. They're great as an appetizer to serve. And I'm just going to get something to turn these so that they get coated really, really nicely. And I will bring this closer to the camera so that you can see the nice creamy sauce and how it coats these meatballs quite nicely. And you can sprinkle this, again, that parsley that you have in the fridge, that pantry staple, you can sprinkle some on to add a little bit of color, which is perfect for this. And we're just going to let those warm up, and I'm going to see if we have a few more questions here. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit. One of the questions about fortifying some of our meals with something rich in calcium. So our powdered milk is a great option for that. So we talked a little bit about how to use it by rehydrating it and using it as milk, but you can actually add it as a dry powder. So if you are making smoothies in the morning, you can add a few tablespoons of that powdered milk right into it. It's flavorless as a powder. So you can add it into anything that you're cooking. I, in fact, could have added more to this sauce if I wanted to, or right into the meatball mixture, and that would increase the amount of calcium in them with that powdered milk, which is super, super easy to do. Some of the other things that maybe you're making already, or maybe the kids are making, are pancakes. In that batter, you can actually put a few tablespoons or that third cup of powdered milk right into the flour mixture, and then add your liquid as you would. So it's fabulous to use in that regard. You could also get really, really creamy mashed potatoes by stirring in that powdered milk as you're mashing the potatoes. So you could add some broth in there if you wanted to, add more milk, however you want to create that creamy texture. But by adding that powdered milk, you actually create a little bit of a nice, smoother, richer, creamier product, which is absolutely delightful because that's what we want. We want that delicious food to make us feel good and stay healthy. All right, so this is looking absolutely delicious. This is the part that you can't smell this, but it smells really good in here. Between the new batch of meatballs in the oven and these meatballs in our creamy mushroom sauce. So that's what they look like. I know there's a little bit of a glare on there, but they're coated perfectly. And this amount of sauce is perfect for almost the whole batch of, because I did take some out there, and I'll be honest, I did sneak some meatballs before we started, so I had to make sure that they were okay. So this is a perfect amount to enjoy with the sauce, which is really, really nice. All right, I'm just gonna see if we have any other questions here. Okay, this is a great question. So sometimes as we get older, we don't necessarily feel like we want to cook for ourselves or for anybody. And we don't always have someone maybe cooking for us. So it can be a little bit frustrating because we do have to eat and we want to remain healthy. We want to have strong bones and we want to stay active. So we do need to eat and we need to watch what we're eating in the sense of eating good food. So that good food is really what we enjoy. So if you're making something, it can be as simple as these types of meatballs and then dividing it up into smaller portions so that it's maybe for one or two, and then you have multiple meals. But that doesn't mean it has to be the same meal every day. I've just divided these up essentially and created 2 meals. That's our batch of chickpeas. This means I can show you what they look like halfway done. They start to get nice and golden brown. Oh, timer off. There we go. I'll get these a little bit closer. So here's our batch that we made, okay? And then you're just gonna flip them over. I made them so round, they might not roll. There we go. Okay, so we're just gonna flip them over. You can see that they're not sticking, which is perfect. We don't want them to stick. There we are. And then I'm going to put them back into the oven for about another 10 minutes. Okay. Some of them got a little bit darker. I know I have a hot spot in my oven. Some of them are a bit darker than others, but all good. So these are going to go back into our oven for another 10 minutes. All right, perfect. All right, so I'm just going to, if there's any other questions, I'm just going to make sure that I've answered what I've seen here, and hopefully not. Let's see here. I'm trying to make sure that I answered the ones that. I think I answered those ones. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to try to bring these closer to you. And by doing that, I'm going to come around and bring them right, because I want you to see how tasty they are. I promised I'd share if you were all here, but I can't. We do have to respect our social distancing. All right, so there's our meatballs, our meatless meatballs with the mushroom cream sauce. So obviously a little sprinkle of parsley in there would give us, and these are so remember, these are the white kidney beans. So they're a little bit lighter, but you can see the golden color on both sides as they've been turned. Cool. That's the recipe. That's how easy it is. I didn't do that much ahead. I chopped a few things. So this really shouldn't take too long at home. And hopefully you'll be able to share it with your family and make some for another meal. These are delicious, by the way, on a salad. So you could treat them as you would a falafel and enjoy them on a salad with a little bit of tzatziki on the side, some added hummus, tuck them into a pita. So there's lots of options for them for you for lunch or for dinner, and to change things up a little bit. And tuck them in the freezer so that maybe you can have them a little bit later in the week, or maybe in a couple of weeks when you want to change things up again. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I want to encourage you to go to osteoporosis.ca and check out more recipes. We didn't talk too much about canned fish today. We have some great recipes if you're looking, because I know some of you have some canned salmon and tuna in your cupboards that need a home, need a recipe to be used. Maybe we can do that next time together and create some other delicious recipes that are going to keep you and your bones healthy and strong. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Emily, for an informative cooking demonstration and for answering so many questions. Thank you also to all of you for joining us today. Visit Osteoporosis Canada's website to find the recipe for oven meatless meatballs and other recipes at osteoporosis.ca/recipes. You can also find out how much calcium you are getting from your diet by using the calcium calculator. And also there is a list of calcium-rich foods, both of which can be found also on the osteoporosis.ca website. An email with the replay version of this webinar will be sent out within the next few days, along with a summary of all questions submitted. Until next time, thank you, and continue to stay connected and informed.